Okay, I think we're recording now. Uh, Jerry wanted to go back and look at verse 10 just a minute. So I'm going to go back through it right quickly, and then we'll go into verse 11. 1 Corinthians 11:10 first. For this cause ought the woman to have a sign of authority on her head because the angels have power on her head because the angels. Been on King James American Standard. So he's looking back at what he said in the prior one. Verse 9, man is not created, not even created for the woman, but the woman is created for the man. Because woman was created for the man, she needed to have, and this is the word sign of is in italics, and it's authority or power. And so exousia is authority or power. It could be one or the other on her head. And so it's the sign on her head. The American Standard calls it a sign or have power on her head in King James because of the order of creation. So she's to have authority, or she's to have a sign of authority on her head. Now, this word authority is probably a metonymy of the effect where a woman is displaying her submission to man's authority by having a covering on her head. As we went through this, and in my revised edition of the role of women, and I had wrote a whole chapter to these verses, and it's a pretty lengthy chapter. So we're not going to go through all of that, but you have the book, and I will let you read that and study it. I believe some arguments are more thorough than I'm making here. It, I believe, was an outward sign of submission, and it ought not to become a mere ritual. Now, he says because of the messengers or because of the angels, on account of the angels. Now, the Hebrew and Greek words for angel both mean a messenger. So it could be a human messenger, a heavenly or spiritual being. The context has to determine which it is. It could even be used for something that's inanimate. That's Paul's thorn in the flesh. Apparently it was something probably inanimate. It appears to refer to the fact that angels, and I would call that probably spirit beings, heavenly spirit beings, were present in the assembly. They're unseen. Since they were watching, observing our worship, the woman ought to display her submission. That's my view of it. Probably that's the case. They're probably not able to read our minds as God does. Angels aren't. Therefore, they need an outward evidence of woman's subjection to God's law. If angels are somehow involved in our prayers, as we see in Revelation 5:8-3-4, then they will not be involved in a woman's prayer. It does not show her subjection to man, so they won't be involved in the prayer. So Revelation 5:8 and 8:3-4 seems to imply they were involved in prayer in some way. Right? And here are the two passages. I'll read verse 8, 5:8. And when he had taken the book, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having each one a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So the living creatures here, 24 elders. So right here, and we have as well in the other verse down here, the smoke of the incense, verse 4, chapter Revelation 8:4. And so an angel stood before the altar in verse 3, and this incense goes up. That's the prayers of the saints. So some way it appears an angel, that's a heavenly being obviously, is involved in our prayer in some way. But if a woman is not being subjection to man as God directed, then I would assume the angels are not going to aid in the prayer. Does that make sense?
If this verse is talking about a spirit being, a holy angel, then that is outside of that time and that situation. It would be just a universal law type of thing. And if that is talking about that sign of being like the long hair or the hat, well, then that seems to contradict or be in odds with verse 16.
Well,
So
the thing about it is,
I can understand subjection, but
yeah, but in the culture, we conform to the culture.
yes, but this takes it out of the culture. If that's a heavenly being and it's a universal, ought to, or requirement, not a cultural situation.
Well, but I don't think you would, Jerry,
You don't think so?
because what we run into is the angels are going to be involved in the prayer, and as long as the women conform to whatever God's law requires and whatever culture requires, don't violate the culture, then they're going to aid in the prayer.
I thought since it would be, if that was spirit beings, that would have been God's requirement then. But that's the way I
But
understood
God
it.
requires the women to conform to the culture, as long as it doesn't go contrary to God's will.
Well, I can see that, but that seemed like a standalone requirement if that was heavenly angels.
Well, just
We'll keep going and I'll come to grips with it.
okay. Another possible explanation that the angels covered their faces when they stood before God. And Isaiah 6:2, this is a claim that's made by some. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings, which with twain, with 2 of them he covered his face, with twain 2 he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. Another possible explanation is it refers to human messengers, perhaps sent from one congregation to another, and their actions would cause shame on the Corinthian church.
That's what I thought he
There's
was talking about.
All 3 of these positions are taken by various people in their writing on this. There's not unanimity of agreement.
Oh, okay.
These are all the possible explanations that I've run into. I translated for this cause, the woman is obligated to have a sign of authority on her head because the angels. And I put head here, 357, on the head because of, the Greek reads. And the word translated angel means a messenger, either something, a human or a spirit being. So I let that interpretation be for the reader. Okay. Any questions now? James, got any comment?
No, sir.
All right.
I'm good.
Okay. James is gonna let you go first on verse 11.
Okay. Plene ute gune, choris, andros uta, ner, choris, gunakos, and kurio. And I translated verse 11 as, however, neither a man without a woman nor a woman without a man in the Lord.
Okay. Now, we have the order of some of this is different in some manuscripts. And Nestle's 28th edition, I have it on the screen there. I'm going with the text that I've considered the best, okay? It's just the order of the wording. If you read the American Standard, the King James, they have a different order. Okay. All right. Nevertheless, that is, this is something in addition, say, moreover, Paul uses this word at the end of an argument to single out the main point, according to A.T. Robertson. So he's singling out a main point here. This is a restriction upon how the man is to view his role with women. He should not think that men are superior to women. Just because God put men in charge doesn't mean he's superior to the woman. And there's an equality here before God on the standpoint of salvation. Neither is, and it's ute, it's not uday. Now, ute, we've been through this before, but it goes back and it's neither, but it links things that are like subdivisions of each other. Okay, they're related. right? And so neither is the man, right, without the woman, separated from different from her in the sense that they're separated and apart from each other. Both men and women are part of the body of Christ, so we're still both part of that same body. 1 Corinthians 12, and each has a function without which the church won't function properly. Man cannot exist without women, because if all the women died out, the race would die out. You have to have both men and women for the race to be propagated, okay? So without women, God designed us to function as a team. Women are to be a helpmeet for man, a suitable helper, a complement. And I use the word complement here. It's COMPLEMENT right here. I highlighted it for me. Now, let me illustrate this. It's well illustrated because the production requires both the sperm cell from a man and an egg from a woman. Each contributes half of the DNA for the child. And so half of the DNA comes from the mother and half from the father. It's clear also that men and women think differently, but the women's thinking is not inferior to men, it's just different. Women think differently than men do, and each complements the other. And so we have an inherent different nature in our makeup, men and women do. I believe men were made for the role that God wanted them to have. Men are to go out into the world and make a living for the family. And their makeup, their nature is such that they're better able to do that than women are. Neither the woman without the man, so that she can't exist without the man. I know they're trying to figure out how to make women have babies without a man and without artificial insemination. And they're trying to do that. I don't think they'll be able to do it. Right? In the Lord's church, there are functional differences, but there's no difference when it comes to receiving the inheritance, and that's 1 Peter 3:7. On the day of judgment, even the functional differences will be swept aside. They'll all be equal. And I'll get that from several passages and put them together. In the Lord, now we've already defined this. This is in knowing God. It means to have an understanding of the will of God and to know or to be intimate with God. So in the service of God, men and women are equal in value. They don't have any, even though they do have different roles. But they're all going to receive an inheritance. Nevertheless, neither is man without the woman nor the woman without the man in the Lord. Any questions?
I was going to see if the way I worded this is a legal way of doing it. Because when I looked up choris, it was without or apart from or without the agency of in months. And so because that seemed to be the gist of it, so I put, however, neither is a man without the agency of a woman, nor is a woman without the agency of a man.
I don't see anything wrong with that translation.
Okay.
Notice what I put here. Existing separately from, without.
Yeah, because that's kind of what I was trying to say in those words.
But I want to go back up to verse 7 because you weren't here last week. I want to go back to verse 7. We'll come back to verse 12. Verse 7 is kind of important. We went through this. For the man indeed ought not to have his head veiled. That's not a literal translation of it. All right. For the man indeed ought not to have his head veiled. Ought not to have his head veiled. Now the word ook, all right. This word here, there are two things about it. The negative usually negating, and that it has to do that in order to be some kind of a system about it. So it's going to go before it. So if you had more than one verb, it would go right before the one it negates. So it's negating the word ought. Right? Right? And so he is not obligated, okay, to cover his head. That's what it's saying. The ook, oo, and the kappa is there because of the vowel following it. So it's just oo. And it never negates an infinitive. This right here is an infinitive. Now it's translated like the infinitive is negated, is not to cover. All right? And that's a mistranslation. All right? Not to have his head covered, veiled. Now, the better translation is this. It is not likely, and of course, we're wearing veils. Or, let's see here. Thayer says here, to veil or cover one's head, for it is much the image of God. Let's go down here a little more. I want you to see what I did with the translation. And the glory of God. All right. It's possible that certain ones who claim to men should have their heads covered when they're worshiping. I believe this is Jews and Romans were doing this. And in my book, I delve into this in much greater detail, argued. All right. Now, I want you to read the infinitive here. Right at the top of the page, in general, the negative comes before the word or words that it negativizes. So it goes before ophele, and it's common to say that the New Testament, let me highlight that so you see what I'm talking about. Testament oo does not occur with the infinitive, not even an indirect assertion. That's A.T. Robertson. So this oo does not negate the infinitive, all right, the way it's translated. The translators translated this as if the infinitive was negativized, but it never negates an infinitive or participle either. So may is used to negate them. Now, right, someone was claiming men ought to cover their heads when praying, and Paul is denying that they should. Right. Now let me give you this. We'll go through all this again. The verse is saying his man is not obligated to cover his head. I believe that I provide evidence in my book that the Jewish and Roman men were probably trying to make the Greek men cover their heads. Samuel Stanley Porter, Greek authority, wrote here in 1 Corinthians 11:7, he takes this verse and he says, for a man is not obligated to have his head covered. That's what he says. He's not obligated to have his head covered. Right? So there's no obligation to cover it. So that's how I translated it. For a man indeed is not obligated to cover the head, being the beginning of the image of the glory of God. The woman is the glory of man. So this verse is not saying what they're claiming it's saying. And I'll give more documentation in my book. In that chapter on this chapter 11, 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. Answer questions? Right. Jerry, can you do verse 12 for us, please?
Okay. I can't tell if that's rough breathing or
It's rough.
rough. Hosper, Gar, He, Gune, Ek, Tu, Andros, Vitos, Kai, O, Oner, Dia, Tes, Gunikos, Ta, De, Panta, Ek, Tu, Theu. And I put just as the woman that it is out of the man, and in the same way the man is through the woman, but all things from God.
All things can be out of God.
Out of God. I put out of God, but then I added from because I wasn't
So,
sure.
Woman came out of man. So the King James American Standard, now the translation is not wrong, but I think it's probably falls short a little bit in Genesis 2. Eve was created from Adam's rib. Hebrew carries the idea of a piece of the side. And that's how, in fact, it's usually translated the side, that Hebrew word. And of course, Adam said, she is now what? Bone of my bone and what? Flesh of my flesh. So Eve was created not just from the rib, but she was created from the rib plus, I believe, some flesh tissue that was taken from his side as well, bone and flesh. It's not a big deal, but what I'm saying here is that she came out of man. The first woman came out of Adam, out of the man. And then all other men come through a woman by childbirth. Does that make sense? So one can't do without the other. Women wouldn't be here if you didn't have a man for her to come from. And all men except Adam come through a birth. Okay. So this is ek, it's ablative of source. Eve was made from the rib, from the side, I believe it was flesh and bone both. So, but that's not critical for my point here, is the man also by or through to the intermediate agency of the woman. So, all men come to the agency of their own mother, except, of course, Adam. But he's an exception. Everybody else comes through a mother, through the woman. When Dia occurs with the personal agent, it's regarded as the intermediate agent. So here the source and the immediate agent are distinguished in 1 Corinthians 11:2. So they're distinguished. We have a source, that's the man, ek. Then we have Dia, and we have through the agency. So God, through the agency of man, the source, man became the source to that creation, to the creation of woman. Any questions? So Eve had to be in subjection to Adam because of primogeniture rights, because he was created first. And these primogeniture rights follow today when women are to be in subjection to men, and they apply everywhere, right? Not just in the assembly of the church. Okay. The articular construction indicating that this may be a reference to Adam and Eve probably is. That's what I would argue. Okay, this goes back to the very creation. Now, if that's true, let's say it is, someone say, well, it's just referring to Eve. But if Eve is greater than her daughters and her granddaughters, and Eve was not allowed to have authority in either the home or the spiritual realm over men, but man, and then Eve's daughters and granddaughters are not allowed to have authority over men, either in the home or the spiritual realm over man. And of course, the premise of the antecedent is true, and the conclusion follows. So even if this refers to Eve, it still applies to all of Eve's offspring, which would be everybody, and all women are offspring of Eve indirectly. It's great, a whole bunch of great grandmother. The headship of man or woman implies woman is not to have authority over man in either the home, 1 Peter 3:1-6, or in the spiritual realm, 1 Timothy 2, verses 8-14. Right? We know the spiritual realm is involved because it applies to praying and prophesying and teaching God's word. Right? if it's referring to Adam and Eve, then man was also of the woman, is referring to man being completed by the woman. So if someone would say, well, now, how would the man be of the woman? He's completed through her. And so if that's the case, and I think it's referring to generically people living today, all of them come through women, through a woman. But it could be that man is completed, she is the complement.
Well, that's a true statement, that men come through women.
Yeah.
And then it's also true that in that one case, the woman was initiated or
Yeah.
started from out of
Yeah.
man, which is different.
So both are true. I don't know which one is the case here, but neither one of them gives up any other position we're holding. It's my contention that God's original intent regarding the headship of man or woman was lost due to the ignorance of God's will after Adam and Eve sinned. The ruling of men or women after sin entered was not what God intended. We know this because what we see in the world is quite a different pattern than what's set forth by Jesus as he serves for the head of the church, his wife. He becomes the pattern for a perfect husband. And so many men don't follow that pattern today. And it's ignorance of God's will. Right? Just because man is the head over a woman doesn't mean that he is to be a dominant dictator type ruler. And so there's some limits on to what he should be doing and how he should be functioning. But all things are out of God. God as creator should be obeyed above all others. His right by creation supersedes all other rights. I think verses 11 and 12 are an implicit warning to men not to allow their pride to cause them to elevate themselves. You see this problem in 1 Timothy 3:6, where being elevated to a position of responsibility might cause one to be puffed up. This is one who's a novice and he becomes an elder, and that could puff him up, right? It's pride. Any questions? For even as a woman, my translation is out of the man, in this manner is the man also to the woman. For all things are out of God, all things came from God. All right. I think we can get another verse in.
Yeah, we have 15 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Are we back to James?
Mhm.
James, can you read verse 13?
Yes, sir. Inhumine autois prenata preton estin gunaika akata kaluton pro theou prosukestai. And I translated that, you judge by yourselves. Is it proper that a woman is uncovered to pray to God?
Okay. Okay. So are you translating it as imperative or indicative mood there?
The
Judge.
judge. Oh, I translated more as an imperative.
Imperative, okay. So he's commanding the judge, make this judgment among yourself or by yourself or within yourselves. Okay. Is it seemly? Is it what? Conspicuous or imminent? Is it seemly or is it fit? Is it proper for a woman to pray unto God? Okay. Pray unto God unveiled. Right.
That's a middle too, so I put pray for herself unveiled.
It is the middle voice, okay? And we just got through covering that in the very middle voice in our Greek class. Let me point out here, it's likely the definite article here is used in the depict the true God. Because I don't find any references to God where the word theos is used with the article. It doesn't refer to the true God. So he's not talking about pagans praying. He's talking about praying to God, the true God. I don't think that's much of a problem about members of the church compared to anybody else. I just want to point that out. If it were seemly to be of pagans for a woman to pray and prophesy in a pagan sense, deliver an oracle, then this would be making the point that this is not seemly to pray to the true and living God. Right? Let me lay out what I believe was documented in my material, and you probably need to read my material in my book, because what I have laid out is I'm convinced that we have three groups of people here. We have Jews, Romans, and Greeks in this church. That's the primary three groups. And I believe there was a mixture of requirements among these people and thinking as to what ought to be done. And the Greek men did not cover their heads when they prayed, but the Romans did, and the Jews did. All right, and so we showed this, I believe, last week to some extent. Right. The usual assumption is the Apostle Paul expects a no answer. And of course, the structure doesn't guarantee that, but I think that's probably what's happening here. I think we don't have a reason to claim it has to be a no answer. But to me, it appears from the follow-up arguments that he's expecting a no answer. Right? Commandment judge, he is determined that has not yet made the judgment. He commanded them to make it. And so Summers says the present imperative has to do with action which is in progress. The aorist has to do with action that has not yet started. Summers, page 112. Others should be cited saying the same thing.
That's not an aorist? Oh, it is aorist.
Aorist imperative, okay. We go back.
Yeah. Well, I thought that meant they had been judging already. They've been really thinking about this, estimating, considering it.
Okay. Dana and Manny say the same thing. I cite some others. Okay. There's no interrogative words in this verse.
Okay.
Tell us that it's a question, but I think it is. Doesn't have to have an interrogative to be a question. I think it's probably a question, though. And, if it's a declarative sentence, then some at Corinth would be saying it was wrong for a woman to pray unveiled. But Paul would be saying that it's not wrong. Okay? The word krino frequently refers to judgment matters not related to areas of obligation. I give several passages toward the bottom of the screen right now: Acts 20:17, Romans 14:3, 4, 5, 10, 13, so forth. Here in 1 Corinthians 10:29, Colossians 2:16. Paul may be telling the church to come to unity of judgment, and that would be nome. And that's back in 1 Corinthians 1:10. But the president finished it to pray. It's possible that it has in mind that women were being prayer leaders. The thrust of the president finished. This has middle passive form. Right? And it's a middle voice, so they're praying for themselves or following the lead of a man leading public prayer. For more notes on the present infinitive, I've dealt with it in more detail. Right? Okay. The women are praying when they say amen to a prayer. And I believe that's all right to them to say amen to a prayer. And the prayer of a man leading the prayer in the assembly becomes a woman's prayer when she amens it. Right? comments there? All right. You all judge among yourselves, is it seemly for a woman to pray unto God uncovered? And so you make that judgment. Right? Okay. Now we get to verse 14. I don't know how far along. We've got probably time to cover that one more verse, okay? Good, Jerry, could you?
Okay. Uday, Ate, Phusis, Didaske, Humas, Huti, Aner, Min, Ian, Koma, Atima, Atimia, Aton, Estin. Or does, this is where I got a question on, or does not even the native condition itself instruct each of you, or teach each of you, or teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame or dishonor to him?
Okay.
And I didn't put nature because it didn't have to be nature. It would be the native condition was also one of the definitions.
All right. Let's look at nature and native condition. I don't think native condition is a wrong translation necessarily. Okay?
But it actually, it will be construed something totally different than
Oh, yeah.
nature.
I agree.
Well, I don't believe it's nature that teaches it, because then all the ones that had the Nazarite vow would have been shameful. And
Okay.
it wasn't, so,
I agree. And that's one of the things I use in my book,
yeah.
the Nazarite vow. But I want to look at Uday first. It continues the negation. That's why I think that verse 13 is expecting a negative answer. Does that make sense? Because Uday, it always continues the negation. So now let's go on to what Jerry was saying. So that's why I take it to be what I have translated it, and the way the translators translated it. Phusis is the nature, it's translated nature of things, but it's something that could have come about as a result of habit, right? And so it's used sometimes just by traditions that are required. It's not necessarily something that's inborn in you. Something could be by practice we could adopt. And so why did you render that again, Jerry?
The native condition.
The native condition, the condition that's been acquired by habit, by practice, that would not be a bad translation in itself, see, that native condition.
Because it goes with verse 16.
Yeah. Doesn't it teach you, see, this is authoritatively teaching you that if a man have long hair, so what you've been living with in your society teaches that, okay? And this is the hair of the head, long hair. Now, if this is a timeless principle, it goes back to Genesis, it's a timeless principle. We have a problem with it. Now, if it's inherently sinful, then we get, as Jerry pointed out, the Nazarites, which I have on the middle of the screen right there. Number 6, 1 through 21. Right? A man praying with his head covered brought dishonor upon his head. If the head covered means long hair, then the Nazarite could not pray without dishonoring his head. But I believe a Nazarite could pray. So my argument is, if a Nazarite could pray with long hair without dishonoring his head, then the covering of 1 Corinthians 11:4 would not be necessarily long hair, or it wouldn't be something that would be binding by God. It could be a custom, human custom, but it's not something God bound, because he let the Nazarites pray. He told them to not cut their hair. And
Yet he would not tell them to sin.
would not tell them to sin.
So I took it not as a universal law.
Now we can go back to the woman not having her hair shorn or shaven. We go back to the Old Testament, we see the captive women that they were going to marry, they had to shave their heads before they married. So again, that woman was commanded by God to have her head shaven. And a person who had leprosy was commanded to shave their head. Okay? So what we get into is a person with leprosy, he would be sinning if this were a sin. I'm arguing this, if the Nazarite can pray with long hair without dishonoring his head, the principles of 1 Corinthians 11:2 through 16 are timeless, and Paul's opposition to long hair is based on local custom. He's not saying it's a principle that God requires, but it's custom requires it. That's one of the reasons I think it's just custom. Right? So I argue it's based on a custom, based upon that. It's a dishonor to him. The word nature refers to things that are acquired practices of men, and I give several scriptures in the middle of the screen right now for that. Romans 2:14, Galatians 2:15, Ephesians 2:3, and 2 Peter 1:4. And linking it back with verse 13, I think it shows that Paul is expecting a no answer to his question in verse 13. Because of the day, a woman's hair is given for a covering or a face covering. I believe this is also in the realm of custom. Right? Now let me give you this, and we give Gerhard Friedrich in Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, volume 9, page 272. The only passage that Paul has phusis in the nominative and absolute is 1 Corinthians 11:14, the passage we're reading here. Here, of course, nature is personified as a teacher of man. Nevertheless, simply represents the general order of nature. It's only task to remind us of what is seemly and becoming. What is seemly in that society? What is seemly? I believe it's a custom in the United States for a man to take his hat off when he prays. Right? And I would take my hat off. As I said last week, I was preaching a funeral for a man, wasn't a member of the church, and his children were good friends with my children. And so I tried to get them to study with me, and I just wasn't able to get them to study. But I preached his wife's funeral, and then I preached his. And at his funeral, it was like 20 degrees outside. It was on the west side of Oklahoma City where they're being buried. And the north wind was blowing. And at the graveside, they just had a graveside. And when I was preaching, and the wind was blowing like 40 miles per hour and 20 degrees, and I had a parka on, a hood with a parka, I flipped my parka back when I began to preach and when I prayed. Why? Nobody else flipped theirs, uncovered their heads. None of the men did, but I did, because I was thinking someone might think I was doing wrong, okay? So I just got my head cold. I didn't get sick, didn't die of pneumonia or anything, so I'm still here. So I translated this as, "I'm not even nature itself teach you, if a man indeed have long hair, it's a dishonor to him." And I translated it that way, but again, it's a different word, not of value. All right. And we find in verses 4 and 5. All right. We're going to stop there and start on verse 15 next time. And now, Jerry, do you have my electronic copy of my book, the Royal Women book?
No, but I got the paper copy.
Okay, well, no, but it's not in there.
Oh,
Okay. Okay. Okay, we'll
I'll
do
double check to make sure I didn't get that.
we'll do this next week.
You're still recording.
Are we over, baby?
Mr. Fox?
Yeah, I know it's still recording.
Oh, okay. That's what I was wondering.
I clicked on it and it hasn't turned black yet. I don't know why it's not stopping the recording.
We'll go ahead and back on out then.
I'll back out there. That'll stop it.